Welcome to the Green Interview. For the past 12 years, since 2008, Silver Donald Cameron and I have traveled the world, interviewing and documenting leading thinkers, lawyers, activists, and many others as we tried to bring a wider environmental awareness to our audience. From activists to astronauts, scientists to grandmothers and teens, as well as many First Nations leaders, along the way we were privileged to spend time with people who gave us new perspectives, made us think about environmental problems and solutions in new and innovative ways, made us cry, made us laugh, and most importantly, gave us hope. Don and I always knew that our green journey would end someday. Neither of us was getting any younger, and we weren't exactly young when we started the Green Interviews. So, after 10 years of production, we decided to pre-record what would be our final Green Interview, with Silver Donald Cameron himself as the guest, telling the story of the Green Interview and of his own environmental journey. This is that interview.
Over the years I've done a lot of radio and television, as well as print work, and my colleague on this project, Chris Beckett, has also been in radio and television for all of his working life, including at Mount St. Vincent University. So there's in a sense, it's like, you reach back and you draw up a thread that I'd never totally abandoned. But really what happened there was the CBC stopped hiring freelancers to any great extent, and so it became harder and harder to get a gig with, say, ideas, or to get a documentary film that I didn't usually produce them, but I used to write them and frequently narrate them. So that goes back, well, I guess my first CBC appearance was in 1963 in Vancouver. And it's been more or less strong depending on circumstances ever since. Did a lot of radio plays, for example. And the same thing is true with the environmental side of things, what's happened with the environmental work is I started really, I can trace that back at least to the Mysterious East magazine, of which I was an editor in 1968-69. And we started doing environmental reporting out of Fredericton, back at that far back. And we were talking about things like water pollution and so forth. And one of the things we thought was that there should be an actual dedicated Ministry of Environment within each of the governments. And there was not one in Canada at that point. So again, as the environment has become more and more of a serious consideration, as we've begun to see more and more how the stuff that was incipient in 1969 has become full-blown crisis in the 21st century, more and more that's become a concern of mine, and that was even true in the column. I was writing the newspaper column up until 2011. Increasingly, as I wrote the column, I kept on thinking these are the issues that really are absolutely critical to any kind of human future. And there's some really interesting people doing really interesting things, and that's what really led to the Green Interview, was the thought that it would be possible to go and meet some of these people, talk to them in some depth about what they were doing, why they were doing it, where they saw the future going. And that's it's a very congenial way of getting at some of these big issues.
And can you talk a bit about that evolution personally into environmental thinking? I mean, you were kind of ahead of the curve, I think. It's very mainstream now to talk about, think about, have environmental ministries, but you were a little ahead of all that. At some point in your career, you seemed to make the decision to focus more on this. Was there a watershed moment for you, or an aha moment, or was it more of a slow evolution?
I think it's more of a steady evolution, that it became more and more apparent to me that these were some of the really big issues. I look back and I think, for example, that I was really preoccupied with social justice and things like the labor movement back in the 1970s, coming out of the 1960s, and that whole sort of social ferment. And that's not ceased to be important, but it's become more and more clear that we've had these kind of like sea changes in the way we do things, and so a lot of the things that affected the labor movement were environmental issues ultimately, and that became more and more clear as I went along. So I guess it really was the growing sense that we were going to solve these environmental problems, or we were not going to get through it as human beings.
So you made this decision just to sort of switch medium, although as you said it wasn't totally new to you, and in fact you were a founding member of Taliil in Isle Madame, the local station there. But you made this decision to seek out some of the brightest, most interesting minds in the environmental movement globally. How did you go about identifying who you wanted to speak to and making it all happen?
Well, the sort of the curation process of it, to some extent, that was also an outcome of the column, because a lot of times I had been reading, you know, the work of someone like, say, James Lovelock or Paul Watson, who I had met. Actually, I met on the ice in 1976 at the seal hunt, which tells you again how far back some of this continuity goes. But and I had thought over and over again, gosh, wouldn't it be fun to talk to this person? Or I'd really like to ask this person how he sees it now, the book having come out 10 years ago or something like that. So there has never been a really a great system to it. It's been, but I also wanted to make sure that it was quite varied. I mean, I wanted to make sure we were talking to people across a range of things. So, you know, Jane Goodall talking about chimpanzees and primates and how all that goes together, and, you know, talking with Lovelock about Earth systems thinking, which he really kind of invented, and you know, talking with James Hansen about global warming, as we did a few weeks ago. I wanted to make sure that we were looking at the whole range of it, because it really does affect all of human life, and there are many different ways that people are coming at it, and that in itself is a fascinating story.
And so you're sitting down with, I mean, I imagine some of these people are people you personally admire, many accomplished people like David Suzuki, Vandana Shiva, Jane Goodall, who you mentioned, Elizabeth May, many very accomplished and fascinating people. What is your approach as an interviewer? I mean, I'm sure you also have many of your own ideas, and there's a conversation to be had, but of course you want to draw out what they have to do. So what's your approach in terms of how you approach the green interview and bring out the best of your subjects?
Well, generally they don't get on the green interview unless I admire them very much. And that's kind of like one of the criteria for it, is that somehow or other they've impressed me with what they've done. And so that takes us in some interesting directions. I mean, for example, Rachel Parent is 15 years old and is an advocate, and a very effective advocate, for the labeling of genetically modified foods in Canada. And she's 15, but she's doing a fabulous job, and so we wanted to have a conversation with her. And I guess the approach is to try and know as much as you can about the person you're interviewing, and to isolate what for you are the really critical, the really crucial insights that are to be had from such a conversation, and then essentially to go to that. But it's also it's two human beings. It's this is somebody. This may be George Monbiot, but Monbiot is another guy who's done some fabulous stuff as an actual environmentalist, in addition to being a terrific writer about the whole subject. So but really the interviews kind of start with the person being interviewed, and with the preparation for that. And one of the things that just delights me is Yvon Chouinard, who's the founder of Patagonia Sportswear and a very dedicated environmentalist. In the middle of the interview, he said, "Wow, you guys have really done your homework." And I thought, yes, we have, and how nice that he noticed that.
It's quite a who's who list that you've interviewed over the years, and by my calculation, there are more than 100, including the people you've interviewed for some documentaries as part of the overall Green Interview project. What has surprised you? Who has stood out or been most interesting to you for whatever reason?
Well, we've tried to do enough of the sort of the marquee names that we've been talking about, that people will look at the project overall and say, oh, this is a pretty significant collection. But we've also tried to get people who were not famous, but who were also doing fantastic things, or were just phenomenal examples. I mean, Betty Crodswick, for example, in BC, when we interviewed her, I think she was 85. She was a great grandmother, and after the age of 80, she spent 2.5 years in prison for objecting to clear cutting in the old growth forests of British Columbia, and refusing to apologize and refusing to say she wouldn't do it again. So she was held in contempt of court 2 years in the slammer, 2.5 years in the slammer. I think that's a story that would give heart to a lot of people, so there are people like that. There's one of them that I keep coming back to often is Hugo Spowers. Hugo's a race car driver in England, who was appalled at what automobiles, which he loves, were doing to the planet, and took it on himself to remove the negative impact of personal transportation on the environment. And did that by reinventing the car. So he now has a little two-seater car that's completely recyclable. It runs on hydrogen fuel cells and generates electricity to each of the wheels. Every piece of it gets recycled. So if you turn it back into him, and he won't sell it, which is another reinvention, he will only lease it to you. So after 3 years, and it's an all-in lease, the insurance and everything is all part of the lease. You give it back to him after 3 years, and he dismantles it, melts down the carbon fiber body, makes another one, and recycles the entire thing. The reason he won't sell it is because he doesn't want you taking it to the dump or anything like that. He wants it to come back to him so that he can recycle it. And reinventing the industry in that he thinks that you should be building cars where those cars are going to be used, and so he's made the whole thing open source. If you want to start building River Simple cars in Halifax, Hugo will give you whatever help he can. It's all on the internet. It's all open source. And his view is the more people are doing the same car, the cheaper components are going to be, the better thinking there's going to be associated with it and its evolution and so on. Not many people know about that. And you would think that this was a quixotic venture that's not likely to have much success, but one of the names of one of his major investors is Porsche. And a gentleman named Porsche, not the company. But this is somebody who knows something about the car business. So if he's into it with Hugo, I would put pretty good money on Hugo having some degree of success. And he's now selling the car in Wales. And selling it is his way of spreading it out is also really interesting because he develops hydrogen filling stations. And then he sells cars within a reasonable range of that filling station. And when that market is sort of saturated, then the next filling station may be overlapping like a Venn diagram, and he starts selling cars in that. So his thought is basically to move filling stations out across England and to spread the cars around the filling stations as they go. Yeah. So a guy like this is somebody that you really want to talk to, and you really want to go and see him, and you want to see his car and so on. So that's one of the ones that comes to mind.
So in a way, it seems the unusual suspects sort of fits your MO of I mean, the whole genesis of the project is the idea of getting people thinking differently. I mean, people don't think of cars that way, and so here's someone you wouldn't expect to be an environmentalist.
That's a really interesting way of putting it, and I don't think I had thought of it quite that way. But you're absolutely right that in a sense the examples of how do we do things differently in order to get different results, that probably is as close to a common thread as there is through the whole series. Yeah. And another little example is Annie Hill and Trevor Robertson, who are two long-distance sailors who spent their entire lives on cruising sailboats. They have not owned homes ashore. They were married when we interviewed them. But the footprint of a cruising sailor in a sailboat is tiny. I mean, they don't eat meat because it won't last after crossing the Atlantic or the Pacific. They're propelled by the wind, and they have an engine that they use a bit to get in and out of harbors. But at the open sea, they never use it. He earns a living by working on oil rigs, which is a little counter to the example. But he makes enough in a month that he can go for a year on the boat, and their footprint is just tiny. So when you say, well, can we really, have a satisfactory, interesting, vital life, and make very, very minimal demands on the planet? The answer is clearly yes, and these are people who are doing it. And you don't have to be in a sailboat to do that either, but that's a nice way of seeing just how a self-contained little operation can work.
Another thing that strikes me about all these diverse subjects of yours is that we tend to look at the environmental movement or the environmental crises, as so daunting, and we look for the solution, and often the big solution, and what will get us through. But what you've got here is really a smorgasbord of potential solutions and different ways that people are tackling this. And I wonder how all this diversity, where does Silver Donald Cameron fall in all this, and how has your own thinking evolved through the process of doing the green interviews?
Well, I guess, yeah, disruptors, I think, would be possibly a way of looking at the choice of the people that we deal with. But really another thing that's key to this whole project is people do find it daunting, and they say, what can one person do? I actually have a TEDx talk called What Can One Person Do? Because I look at people like Hugo Spowers and I think, well, here's Hugo. You know, what can you do about the automobile industry? If you're, you know, smart, an engineer, or you're deeply involved with that field and engage in some fresh thinking, you really can make a change there. Or look at a guy like Ori Vigfusion, who's not a famous environmental figure, but a fabulous one. He just recently died, but he's an Icelander. A wealthy Icelander, a distiller, a hotel owner, and stuff like that. An ardent salmon fisherman realized that the North Atlantic salmon was in trouble and set out to buy and retire all the commercial salmon licenses in the entire North Atlantic basin, from Spain to Russia, from Labrador to Connecticut. And by the time he died, he had actually done 85% of those licenses he had purchased and retired. And he did it by raising a lot of money, and then he would just simply, and you know, he knew how to do that and had made a lot of money himself. But basically what he did was fundraising, and then he would go to all the owners of fishing licenses and saying, I want to buy your license, and I want to help you to get into another line of work that will be more satisfying, perhaps more profitable. There's no compulsion here, and if you want to say no, you can say no, but just remember, when you're ready to sell the license, please call, I'll be interested. Who would have thought one guy could do that, you know? But so that's part of what the motive behind the show is to say to people, you really can do things. When you come up with something that may seem like a crazy idea that's well beyond your capacity, maybe it's not. Look at it hard. Maybe there's a way of doing it, and maybe some of these people will have ideas or techniques or approaches or stories that will inspire you and show you a way forward.
And is that what you set out to do, or is that something that more came to light as you went through the process of interviewing people?
I think it was probably a motivation that was there from the start, but was less articulate. I think often, certainly with people in the arts, I think you get obsessed with something and you kind of blunder forward, and then in retrospect you look back and say, oh, I see what that was all about. I see how that was connected with work that I'd done before. So I don't think I could have articulated this at the beginning, but I think in some sense the motivation was to say there are people out there doing stuff that other people should know about, and why is that? Probably because I'm thinking we all need to find out what we can do and do what we can.
I noticed among your interview subjects, many are Indigenous people, partially because of some of the subjects you've tackled and set out to tackle, I think, but it's interesting how many, not only the Indigenous people you've interviewed, but non-Indigenous people who cite Indigenous sources as inspirations and Indigenous ways of thinking about the world as sources of inspiration for their work on green projects. I wonder if you have been influenced by that, and how you are thinking about the link between Indigenous ways of thinking and being and our current challenge as a kind of global monolithic civilization to some extent, trying to deal with these environmental problems we've created for ourselves.
Yeah, I don't think I had any idea. So many of these things are spread outside the boundaries of the green interview itself. For example, I mean, I'm not a young man, and I can remember the really appalling racism with which the Native people were regarded in my childhood. And I had a couple of benefits there. I didn't actually know, like probably most settlers, I didn't really know Indigenous people. A few people, I did know the odd one here and there, but it was not a big feature of my life. But my piano teacher was a woman named Ida Halpern. And Ida was a musicologist from the University of Vienna who had fetched up in Vancouver after the Second World War, and wound up doing fabulous work collecting the music of the West Coast Native peoples and putting those out on the Folkways label, and just doing fabulous musicology with them. And I remember her talking a little bit about this and about the lack of respect for the First Nations, and about the astonishment people had that there was a musical tradition that was worthwhile paying attention to within that tradition. Well, over my lifetime, and certainly intensely in the green interview process, I've come to see, I think, that basically the First Nations had it right, and that the industrial model that we have is not sustainable. Essentially, this is mining the earth for its resources and leaving it stripped. There's a slide I show sometimes in presentations that shows of the materials and energy we take from the earth to make useful products. 93% is wasted by the time the product is made. It's wasted at the mine head, it's wasted as waste heat, and so on and so forth. So only 7% of what we take from the earth actually becomes useful products. Of that 7%, something over 80% is used once and discarded. And that's a staggering figure. But when you look around, let's say you walk into a grocery store, what is a grocery store selling? It's selling garbage surrounding small pieces of food, but mostly the grocery store is full of plastic, right? And it's used once. It's garbage. It's put in a bag that's used once. It's taken and ultimately it's put in a bag that is produced for the purpose of being thrown away, a green garbage bag, right? And then it goes to the dump. So what we've done is take resources from the earth. So at 6 months after it's the point of sale, 99% of what we took from the earth is in the waste stream, one way or another. Well, if you look at the economy that way, what it really is a gigantic and extremely effective device for turning the planet into junk. And that's not the way that the First Nations would look at it. That's not the way that I think even our ancestors in many other countries, I mean, I'm of mainly Scottish origin, my Highland ancestors didn't treat the earth that way. Right. I know they didn't. And the more I learn about the First Nations and from the First Nations, the more I think this is really the brightest single flame that we have leading us forward.
And are there any of the many Indigenous activists that you have interviewed, are there any that really stand out for you, or their stories were particularly compelling that you can remember now?
Well, they've all been, each of them I would say meets that description, but in a different way, one from another. For example, Edmund Matachewaban, who had a profound impact on me, is a Cree elder from James Bay, from what we call Fort Albany, but he calls Peterbeck, which is his real name, right? Another one of the changes, because I now think we should be calling them by the names that the First Nations gave them, not by the names of Europeans and European places, right, but by the names that they actually have from the people who lived here. Well, Edmund was 8 years old when he was taken to residential school, but he remembers that first 8 years very vividly. He remembers what it was like to live a traditional lifestyle on the land around James Bay, and that's a lifestyle that was sustainable for 11,000 years. So there's an awful lot to learn about the approaches and the attitudes and the understandings that people like Edmund's forebears and Edmund himself, have to offer us. Now, on the other hand, you look at somebody like, say, John Borrows, who's a professor of law at the University of Victoria, one of the most powerful minds I've ever met. And John is an expert not only in English common law and French civil law, but also in the varieties of Indigenous law across the country with the various Indigenous nations. And that is a really fascinating thing too. So you wind up asking John and saying, well, okay, what is law? I mean, those three traditions, all of which are part of the Canadian legal system, those three traditions are very different. So what is law? And John says, well, it's where you find authority, it's where you find guidance in how you should live your life, it's where you deal with the inevitable frictions of living together and so forth. Mm-hmm. And the Indigenous approach to this is that the natural world will tell you. And Todd Labrador, the Mi'kmaq canoe maker who we also interviewed, Todd says the same thing, essentially, that the natural world will tell you what you should be doing. The natural world will give you guidance. If you look at how a bird raises its young, for example, that will tell you what you should do as a parent. How you should understand that, including that at some point you push them out of the nest, right? So I'm not sure that, I guess what I've found as we've been going along here is that the more Indigenous people I talk to, the richer my understanding is of what the Indigenous traditions have to offer us, and the greater awareness I have of my own profound ignorance. But at least I have a sense of where the knowledge is and how to pursue it.
It strikes me that in Canada we are talking a lot about reconciliation now with the recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission that occurred here. It's become more and more of a political topic, but no one in settler Canada necessarily knows what that should look like or where that could go, but there seems to be a lot of insight there from Indigenous people talking about environment as well, and that traditional ways of and historical ways of looking at environment that speak to me of how we reconcile our modern culture with more traditional ways of doing things.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think also there's this is one of the issues I've been puzzling at, and that we really have not tackled in the Green Interview. But I hope that before we actually air this program, we will talk about some of those things. When we were in South America during some of the green rights interviews, and with meeting a whole bunch of people from around the world and doing interviews with them. One of the things that we found was that Bolivia and Ecuador both call themselves plurinational states, so states which contain many nations. Canada doesn't call itself that, but we are that, right? As is the States and as are many other countries. Well, then you come back and say, okay, what does that actually mean? And of course, the South Americans had to grapple with that too. One of our Bolivian interviewees, Pablo Salon, a fabulous, formerly ambassador to the UN on behalf of Bolivia and so on, said that they were, when they drew up that constitution, they were very concerned about it, because did this mean they were going to cut their country up into a patchwork of little tiny states? And the answer was no, that they were going to find ways to kind of delineate spheres of influence where, as we do with provinces and municipalities too, where you say, okay, this falls under this jurisdiction and these people deal with it, and that falls under another jurisdiction and these people deal with it. And I think that's probably a model we should explore. Now, I don't know how that's going to look in practice, but the visual image that I've been finding myself toying with is a color separation in printing. So you have an image, and you have it in magenta, and then you overlay the blue, and then you overlay another color, the green, and each of those is a distinct picture. But the full beauty of the image is not seen until you see them all together. And I think the full beauty of what Canada could be will be seen when we see ourselves all together, mapping together in that kind of way, and enriching and enlarging each other's perspective as we go along.
That's a very interesting way to look at it.
Well, I think this is a huge subject that we have got a long way to go on, but yeah, the potential is really fabulous.
You mentioned a little while ago the wastefulness of our modern economy. And I know one person you interviewed, David Suzuki, once called conventional economics a form of brain damage. Other environmentalists like Chris Turner, who you also interviewed, believe capitalism isn't a lost cause, that perhaps it can be reformed, looked at differently, improved upon, valuing different things differently. What is your insight on that after having interviewed, you're not an economist yourself, but you've interviewed a lot of people who talk extensively and deal extensively with economic concepts. Is there hope for our system of economics, or do we need to really reconsider completely how we do things?
Well, I think my sort of aphorism about that is that capitalism is like fire. It's a good servant but a poor master. And it seems to me that the kind of mixed economy that we had after the Second World War had a lot going for it. There was pretty serious regulation to make sure that the economy worked in the interests of everybody and not just the few who owned capital. And we also were trying to make sure that the benefits that were generated by the economy were evenly spread among people. And I think we've lost both those things to a very large extent, and we now have this rising level of spectacular inequality and public squalor and private splendor, as I think it was Galbraith that used that phrase. And I'm also struck by the fact that when I was a kid, people were saying, well, we were going to have all this technology and robotics and so forth, and what were we going to do with all the leisure? And now we have people scratching far worse than they did then in order simply to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. So I keep thinking there are huge reforms. Will it work? I mean, ultimately your question is capitalism salvageable? And I don't think I know the answer to that, but I think I know that it's not salvageable unless it's reformed in major ways. One of them is a thing like the workday, for example, that we fought for an 8-hour day and got it in the early 20th century. 110 years later, we're still using the 8-hour day, but we've had this vast increase in productivity, and we've got all kinds of people who are poor, who are not getting decent health care, and not getting decent food, so on and so on. And yet we've got this productive capacity. I think we've got to start uncoupling incomes from employment, for example, and we have to start doing something to really make sure that the benefits of capitalism, if it gets spread around to others, and also that capitalism itself stops short of the kind of pillaging that it's really done with something like, say, the cod fishery in the North Atlantic, where unfettered capitalism destroys the resource. And we've seen that over and over again, that you know, you go right to the last fish. And then you look around and now you've got a real economic catastrophe, not just an ecological one, but and that makes it very, very clear that you can't have a viable economy if you don't have a viable environment.
Absolutely, yeah, the links become clear.
Yeah, yeah. Now the mechanism for that, I mean, I think why Suzuki calls it a form of brain damage is because it ignores the fact that it occurs on a finite planet, that it basically says we're going to have infinite growth on a finite planet. You obviously can't do that. If you think you can, you're suffering from brain damage, right?
Yeah.
Suzuki's quite right.
And in fact, numerically credits damage as a positive often in our measurement of these things.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's a theme that's come up in a number of our interviews too, and that we would love to focus on if we can get the opportunity to do it. But yeah, I mean, gross domestic product. There were a couple of splendid examples of that just recently. A Morgan Stanley investment broker's report recently said that the positive effects of Hurricane Harvey will not be felt until the fourth quarter. Hurricane Harvey destroyed, you know, enormous amounts of assets, and killed people and ruined lives and so on and so forth. But the economy sees the recovery from that as a benefit, as a net gain.
Right.
Well, this is brain damage, isn't it? Right? This is really stupid. But that's when people say the economy is doing well, they almost always go straight to whether the GDP is growing.
Right.
GDP can grow for lots of reasons that are not positive for human progress.
So surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, given the range of people you're interviewing in the Green Interview, you've tackled big picture concepts, not only the environment, but the economy, the way we measure happiness, success in life, indigeneity, indigenous ways of thinking. And I think perhaps it is no surprise that you've spun off into 6 other special video projects, including a couple full-length documentaries, a new book called Warrior Lawyers. Can you talk a bit about those side ventures and how they came to be and what inspired those?
Sure. Let me just gather my thoughts a little bit, because where you started to be going with was that we tackled many big issues, and I think really that's an important insight, because I think what we've tried to do is to say there is such the problems that we face as a species, and with what we've done and are doing to our environment, and thus to ourselves, because we are not separate from the environment. We are part of the environment. Which is another real insight from the native people, that we are the earth and the earth is us, and if you damage the one, you damage the other. I think it's important to be looking at the range of responses to this massive overall problem, and that's really what we're talking about with that vast range of subjects. And then a couple of times we've just seen opportunities, once with salmon wars, where there was a large body of opinion, is a large body of opinion that holds that open pen salmon aquaculture is really a destructive process, destructive to the coastal waters and much else. And we found people that were willing to actually invest in making a film about that, so that was the genesis of Salmon Wars. But then we talked in 2012 to David Boyd, who literally wrote the book on environmental rights, and we realized, talking to David, that this was really the keys to the kingdom. This was the universal solvent. This was the tool that you could apply to almost any environmental issue if we had the rights as individual Canadians to go to court and challenge anybody who was infringing our environmental rights. That would be an instrument you could use for almost any particular, on almost any particular issue. So having seen that, we went back to those same investors, and to others, but particularly the original ones, and said, here's one, if you had this, you wouldn't have to be making a special film or a special effort about salmon aquaculture. You could be simply going to court and saying, I can prove this infringes my right to a healthy environment, and therefore you've got to stop it, or you've got to modify it until it doesn't do that anymore. And those investors, to their great credit, including the man who owns the building we're in, saw that and said, yeah, you should do that. And we were able to then to go and raise some other funds and get a little bit of money from public sources like the tax credits and the CBC and so forth, and put that project together. And of course, the other thing that's nice about that is I think we've invented a form which I call the doc, which is a documentary that's built like the deck of a dock on pilings. So the Green Rights film and the Warrior Lawyer's book are kind of like the deck at the top of the dock, but the pilings are the interviews that go deeper. So you may only see Polly Higgins, for example, who wants to make ecocide an international crime. You only see her briefly in the Green Rights film. But if you go on our site, you can spend an hour with her and really get into what she's talking about there. And I think this is a really interesting form.
It truly is a multimedia platform, and you're really taking advantage of the modern tools of the internet there.
I think so. And it's all very exciting. It isn't necessarily, we don't have ways of really dealing with it economically, and we don't have ways of fostering this kind of activity. And in many respects, I think we've suffered from being a bit ahead of our time, but it's been an awful lot of fun too. You know, I mean, I shouldn't let that, I should stress that actually a little bit, because I mean, what it's given to two old geezers, it's given us the chance to go to South America and the Netherlands and, you know, all over the place and meet some of the most interesting people in the world doing some of the most important things in the world. You know, what's not to like?
Not to look too deep behind the curtain, but I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, about the economics and how you've modeled this to make it work.
Yeah, well, that's probably been the area in which I'm least happy about the way it's all worked out. But what we have done is we've found that there are out there some distribution companies that basically specialize in providing materials to schools and universities and libraries, and basically take what we do and then resell it into that broad educational market. And that's been the core of the way that the Green Review has survived. And it's been up and down to some extent as the industry itself has been up and down. I mean, one of the odd things is that Donald Trump has been so threatening to the educational industry, if I can put it that way, that some of them have basically held back a little bit and said, well, we don't want to proceed with a whole lot of new investment in stuff like your films, because we're worried about whether or not the money going into the educational system is going to be able to support us in reselling Green Interviews into the educational system. Who would have thought Donald Trump would have an impact on this, but he has. Yeah. We had thought initially that the big source of support would be individual subscribers, and that has turned out not to be the case. And I think that's not because the potential isn't there. I think the potential is there, but I think to go out and get it requires a bunch of effort put into marketing and a bunch of money put into marketing, and those are resources we haven't had. When we had to allocate scarce resources, we've chosen to put them into making the programs rather than selling the programs.
Right.
Yeah.
And if people are watching this in the 2030s, hopefully Donald Trump is just a bad memory.
Let us hope. Yeah, let us hope. But in 2017, he's very much a part of the environment we're working in. Yeah, I guess this is another aspect of what we've been able to do is that we've done a kind of guerrilla filmmaking. And I mean, this is basically, we could not have done this without the technology that's come along in the 21st century for us. But basically, this whole thing has been done by two old guys, and you know, to some extent pensioners, and you know, we don't have elaborate means, and essentially we've done sort of guerrilla filmmaking. I mean, it's basically the two of us hit the road, hire a hotel room in Ecuador, take the cameras, and you know, go out in the streets, and you know, we hired somebody to help us in Ecuador, but we didn't in the Netherlands, let's say. And we go out and do the filming, and you can do broadcast quality filming with stuff that two guys can carry, pretty much. And of course, that's meant that we've been able to do things that we couldn't have done if we'd required a lot more money. And we know the traditional filmmaking model does use an enormous amount of money, and we really haven't. We've done this on a kind of guerrilla, I think is the right way to look at it, kind of guerrilla filmmaking.
There's a frugality to the approach, but.
Oh, desperate frugality. Absolutely, yeah.
The Green Interview itself, one thing I don't think it is maybe you'll agree or not, but is prescriptive. It's very much about ideas. There are some very good models or examples of what others have done that perhaps could be copied, but it's not giving people a prescription of this is what you do. Although, interestingly, you did stumble on a very fascinating legal tool that is being used to great effect and could be used more in terms of the green rights or the environmental rights. But I don't think you set out to show people this is how you solve the environmental problem. It was more about presenting ideas and thoughts. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how to take that potential energy of ideas and how might those turn into concrete actions or kinetic energy in terms of people enacting environmental solutions?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that my mind goes 2 or 3 ways at once, but one of them is that where we have become more prescriptive is when we've seen something that could be changed and that would make a big difference in a lot of different ways, and that's the green rights thing, for example. But that would also be the Counting What Counts project that we have not done about better ways to measure progress than gross domestic product. But in both those cases, what I think we're saying to the individual is these are tools within your political environment or your economic environment that you can use in God knows what ways, but whatever ways your passion leads you to use them. And speaking of the whole range of the interviews, I think that's the word that people use is inspiring, and that I think had that word applied to this project more than any other. And I think that's right. I think that's what we'd like to do is to say, here's somebody who's done this project in this area of interest, and here's somebody who's done something else, and here's somebody who's making a change in the third way. And the implication is there are things in your life that you care about. There are things in your life that you really are outraged about. You shouldn't assume that you can't do anything about them. We hope to inspire you to go out and deal with the problems you see in your own backyard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there is a case here in Nova Scotia, is there not, where someone has seen the green rights film and taken action on that?
There actually are 2 in Nova Scotia, and I'm thrilled about that. One of them, a man in Lunenburg saw the film and thought, how could I apply what legal tools we do have? We don't have environmental rights, but we do have other tools. Are there other tools that we could apply here? And went and spoke to a wonderful young lawyer, Jamie Simpson. And Jamie and he thought about this and came back to the Harrietsfield water issue. Now that's in our film, Defenders of the Dawn, so people can look it up there. But Marlene Brown, who's the central figure whose water has been terribly polluted by a closed dump nearby, has been trying to get the Department of Environment to do something about it for years. And finally, with the help of Jamie and the fellow from Lunenburg, they went to court to privately prosecute. And I've forgotten now whether it was privately prosecute the government for failing to act, but I don't think so. I think it was privately prosecuting the companies for the pollution of her water supply. And that was finally taken over by the provincial government, which I guess was kind of embarrassed by the fact that a private citizen had done what they are supposed to be doing in the first place. But that came directly out of somebody saying, oh, what are the legal tools that we could use? And the second one is the burning of tires in the cement kiln in Brookfield at Lafarge. And that was a case, again, where the citizens, several people looked at the film, and again, an investor who didn't wish to be named had put up some funds to go to court and try and stop that. I think one of the things that the green rights work specifically says to me is that the proper channels, as they're often known, don't work. That petitions to government and letters to your MP and even demonstrations and that sort of thing, these are useful ways that government and industry can allow you to blow off steam without actually having any real impact. And the 2 things that do seem to have an impact, and I don't mean to suggest that those never do, but by and large the impact is very small compared to the amount of effort that's put out by people in those kinds of techniques. The 2 things that do work, one is the legal system, because that's where you're supposed to go with real evidence, and it's being judged not on the basis of its political viability or its economic impact, but on the basis of its truth and its accuracy and its application to the statutes. And the other one is civil disobedience. And we've seen that in Elsipogtog, New Brunswick, recently, and you can see how it works. Yeah. And particularly when you have civil disobedience that involves a marriage of settlers and Indigenous people, because the Indigenous people do have rights that settlers don't have, but the settlers do have a kind of a credibility and clout that the Indigenous people normally have not had. So the two together, each of them brings some powerful, powerful instruments to the relationship. And in Elsipogtog, what was even nicer was that it was French and English and Indigenous. So it was, three big separate cultural traditions coming together to make
multiple
this one point.
nations within one nation.
That's it. There it is, the plurinational alliance. They didn't call it that, but next time we should.
Yeah, and one great takeaway from the Green Rights film and the Warrior Lawyer's book is that not only might people win court cases and win their rights back in those court cases, but even in a loss, it forces the story to be told in a public way and a detailed, evidence-based way that it otherwise might not get.
This is the point that this is the viewpoint of Tony Aposa, who's this wonderful lawyer in the Philippines, who basically says it's a form of storytelling. And he says, if I hold a press conference, who comes, who listens, and how long does it last? But if I take it to court, then I'm telling the story in a way that is evidence-based and that is going to be proven or disproven. There is going to be a record. People are going to discuss it and determine it. And if you lose, you appeal, and then you get to tell the story again. And he has carried these stories to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. I mean, the one that made his reputation is one where he went to court on behalf of future generations to stop logging and clear-cutting in old-growth forests, and won and established there with that victory that future generations do have legal rights in court that can be pursued on their behalf. And that's called intergenerational equity, and it's now a principle that law courts around the world recognize. One guy in the Philippines. So. But yes, that's true. The whole business of the law as being not just an arid thing, and like with Tony's approach, even if you lose, you win, as long as the story got told and told well. Right? And if you lose it once, you appeal and tell it twice or three times.
It echoes to me the approach of the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not just here in Canada, but the South African one after apartheid. This whole idea that we need to systematically air our grievances for them to be known. And if the public knows about them, then you will start to see forward motion on things.
And interestingly enough, that same process is the subject of one of our most recent Green interviews with Maxine Burkett. And Maxine is a lawyer, a law professor at the University of Hawaii, and her specialty is the legal implications of climate change, particularly sea level rise on South Pacific Island nations. Because that's a really interesting, it's tragic and terrible, but it's also from a legal point of view really interesting. What happens to a country when its territory is overwhelmed and it doesn't have any land base anymore? Right. So what happens to the Maldives or to the Marshall Islands or the Seychelles or many other, Kiribati, Tuvalu and so on, all these little island nations? What happens to them when sea level rises and they don't have any territory anymore? Those people they're still citizens of a nation that in effect doesn't physically exist anymore. What obligations does the first world have, which created the problem that they're suffering from? What obligations do we have to them to resolve their dilemma? How could those be articulated and how could they be measured and how could they be enforced? Very, very interesting legal questions, and her answers to that are also based on what happened in South Africa and to a lesser extent what's happening here.
So the Green interview has taken you around much of the world, exposed you to people, some of whom you might not known existed before, and concepts such as green rights that have really revolutionized your thinking. I'm sure there are many others you have not yet interviewed. Can you name anyone who's on your list? Perhaps by the time people are watching this, they will have been interviewed. But right now, as we sit in 2017...
Well, Prince Charles declined so far. You know,
Keep working on them.
Perhaps we'll get Prince Charles. And I regret a few people. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right, but Mangarai Wato. No, I'm not. Again, I'm not. I'm wrong. A woman in Kenya who was internationally recognized for her work in replanting and reforesting Kenya. And unfortunately, she died, and there have been a number of people like that who've just gone and passed away, and we haven't got to see them. I have a multi-page list of people that I'd like to see, and there are and a number of them I think would be in the class of very senior people who may not be around that long, and like I feel like if we're talking about somebody like Rachel Parent, who I mentioned earlier, the GMO food activist, she's 15, she's going to be around for a long time. That's not necessarily the case with Joanna Macy in California, or with Sylvia Earle, the great underwater explorer, or even Paul Hawken, who's also happened to be 3 in California, partly because I'd like to go to California and get a number of people who are Gary Snyder, the poet, there are a number of people who are getting up into their senior years, and I would like to be sure that if I had unlimited sort of resources, that's where I would start. I would say, who are the most important, most senior people that we're likely not to get to talk to again. I mean, I'm really pleased we got a great interview with Farley Mowat, for example, not too long before he died. Yeah. And that's going to become increasingly important as the years go by. Nobody's going to get another interview with Farley.
Mm-hmm. And an interesting piece of that, the economics of the project that we discussed, is that when you go somewhere, you're very strategic about getting as many interviews as possible since you've made the trip, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we went to England at one point. We did 5 interviews in 5 days in different parts of England. We did, Hugo Spowers with the River Simple Cars in Shropshire. We saw Mark Boyle, the moneyless man from Ireland, who's tried to live without money for many years because he feels money gets between him and the impact of his activities on the world. And so he's now, 4 or 5 years he's gone without money now, and says he's happier and healthier than he's ever been. Rob Hopkins of the Transition Project, Transition Towns down in Devon. I'm missing George Monbiot in Oxford. So, but they're all within. We got them all within a 4 or 5 days. And in Ecuador, I think we got 13 interviews, or in the trip to South America. In the Netherlands, 4 or 5 in the same week, and so forth. And yeah, it's partly it's economics. It's partly we don't have the money to go back and forth to the Netherlands. We got to go once and do it right. But the other one is carbon. I mean, traveling is, flying is not without its environmental impacts. Yeah. And I don't want to do that unless I can unless I can look God in the eye and say, look, we thought that the work was important to do. We think it justifies the carbon expenditure, and we minimize the carbon expenditure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes perfect sense. So I don't see any signs of slowing down with this project, despite the fact that we're planning ahead with this venture today. This could go on a long time, hopefully. And what I wonder is, what do you see someday looking at as the legacy of the Green Interview?
Well, you're right. It could go on, for quite. I don't see any particular point where it would intrinsically have to end. I mean, if we had another 100 years of life and energy, I'm sure we would, because people are coming up all the time. There always are new ventures, and new innovations. And a guy named Boyan Slat, for example, from the Netherlands, who we did not get, but Boyan was, I think, 18 or 19 when he decided his mission was to clean up the great islands of garbage in the middle of the oceans, right? Man, would I love to interview him, And he's now maybe all of 22 or something of that kind. So there will be, I'm sure, as the world evolves, there's going to be more and more people that you could be interviewing. I will feel very happy, I think, and I suspect I speak for my colleagues too, if at the end of this we have a series of interviews where you get to meet people who have really been thinking seriously and taking serious action about improving the world, and recognizing that that's something that it isn't just the towering figures of our age who get to do that. it's guys like Boyan Slat, 19, 20 years old, and decides that he's going to do that. And even if he doesn't get it all done, the effort will be worthwhile. The recognition of the problem, the promotion of the problem, that's all going to be worthwhile. And if the message that we finally give to people is, the situation's not hopeless, and you've got a role in it. That would be, I think, the heart of it.
And in the interviews, one gets a real sense of the humanity of the subjects. I mean, when you focus on someone for an hour, ask them questions, they're all very articulate and intelligent, but they're all very human. They're there sitting in a chair, fairly normally dressed, most of them. They strike one as just, it is very intimate, I suppose, is what I'm getting at.
Yes, and I think that's part of what I like about the format, is that it is personal, it is intimate, it is very warm and very human, and you also get a sense of the passion that drives these people. You get a sense of them as being people who wake up in the morning and this is what they do. Somewhere along the line, their life has taken this path, and now they're having a real impact. That's why we're having the conversation. Yeah.
Can you talk a bit? It's rare to have an hour-long long-form interview, as it used to be called, but it's so rare you rarely hear that term anymore. Could you talk a bit about that decision and how that has resulted in the conversations you've had?
Well, I've always loved the long-form interviews. When I think back at the beginning of television, I remember there used to be discussions between Lionel Trilling and Jacques Barzun and what was that wonderful interviewer. Or there used to be presentations by Leonard Bernstein about music, and I found those really fascinating, and regretted very much when they kind of went away and sound bites took their place. So one of the things that I don't think you really can get the truth and any kind of profundity out of a soundbite. I think you really have to spend time enough to really talk about not only the basic idea, but the implications and how it came about and where it might be going, and that this takes a little time. The other thing, I guess, that's interesting about that too is how many of the interviewees are really delighted when we come and ask them, because nobody does that anymore. Nobody comes around and says to them, tell me about what you're doing. And very often what they're reporting is in scientific journals, or it's in small activities one place or another. And it's not in the general culture, and we are trying to put it into the general culture. So people say, well, you really want to hear about this. And sometimes we had one funny experience with Andy Bischelbaum, who was one of the Yes Men, who was expressed astonishment. He said, you guys are doing real old-fashioned television. And I guess in some respects we are doing real old-fashioned television, but people seem to love it because they don't get the chance really to talk about, if you've spent 10 years working on something and somebody gives you 30 seconds to talk about it, kind of frustrating. Yeah. But if somebody gives you an hour, that's a real pleasure.
Mm-hmm. You once said, not that long ago, I think, that the great thing for you about this, perhaps also for your viewers, is that you get to spend an hour with one of the world's great thinkers about the future and talk about the future. On the broadest possible way, beyond the green interview, when you think about the future, what do you imagine?
Well, Paul Hawkins said, and we have tried several times to interview him, we've been in touch with him, haven't managed to do it yet, but he said, if you aren't pessimistic, you haven't read the science. If you aren't optimistic, you haven't met the people. And I guess that I'm made optimistic by the fact that I've met so many terrific people doing really wonderful things, and doing them out of the core of who they are. I mean, these are what these people care about. This is what they do in the world. This really defines them to a large extent. I'm very optimistic when I think there are so many people doing so many things in this way. We only scratched the surface with the green interview. I'm pessimistic when I think we do so much out of ignorance as a species, that we don't use the precautionary principle. We just go ahead and spray pesticides, and then only later do we discover the hideous results that sort of thing has. We're not careful. We're not caring. You know, we don't, and we don't think of, this is another thing where I think the Indigenous people have it absolutely right and the rest of the culture has it pretty much wrong, is the world is a sacred place. As far as we know, this is the only speck in the entire universe where there is life. You know, chances are there are other ones out there, but we don't know about it. This is the only planet that sustains life and sustains it in this spectacular, glorious variety in all kinds of forms and so on and so forth. If that isn't sacred, what is? And I think that's what that's for me, that's the heart of what the Indigenous people have to tell us is stop and look around you, look at what a marvel this planet is. You've got to treat it with care and respect. Well, what makes me pessimistic is when we don't do that, when we just go ahead and say, I mean, we now got a situation where apparently there is no water in the world that isn't to some extent polluted with microparticles of plastic. And there was no plastic when I was a kid. Plastic came along during my lifetime. And I look at that and I think, well, this is a terrible loss, and we've got to stop doing that kind of thing. Well, the fact that we haven't yet figured that out is what would make me pessimistic, and what really would bothers me is the possibility that we've done something like what we did with DDT, but on a larger scale. We've carelessly used it, we've allowed companies to go out there and make money out of it, and we really haven't challenged any of that. And maybe we've done something already that is irreversible. I mean, if we've done something that kills off the pollinators, we have really attacked life at its roots, and we may have done that. We may have done that, and that's what really scares me.
What gives you hope?
The people. You know, the fact that we are not. It's not impossible for us to learn, and many of us are working on this, and the transition in the last 20 or 30 years has been spectacular. I mean, everybody is now talking about sustainability. Everybody is now seeing that as a lens through which we have to look. There may be all kinds of hypocrisy about it, but I'd rather have people being hypocritically in favor of the right things than not. You're not in favor of them. And so I guess I look at and change can happen really quickly. I mean, look how fast we dealt with the ozone layer. Look how fast smoking became more or less, socially unacceptable. I mean, and we tend to forget those things. We tend to forget that, landmines, right? How long did it take us to get an agreement on landmines? Not to say that you can't go backwards on some of these things, or that, it's not a simple story, but we really can deal very effectively with major problems when we, as a species, perceive that these are major problems and come together to work on them.
Silver Donald Cameron, in conversation with author Chris Benjamin. My colleague and friend, Silver Donald Cameron, died on the 1st of June 2020, leaving me with the sad duty of wrapping up what has been a fabulous adventure and a privilege to have met so many environmental influencers who also generously shared their knowledge and ideas. Don and I both hoped that the Green Interview would still be a useful resource and a good educational tool long after we were both gone, and I certainly hope that will be the case. Thank you for sharing your time with the Green Interview. We hope that the experience has meant as much to you in viewing them as it was to us in making them. For the Green Interview, I'm Chris Beckett. Thanks for watching.